All right. So for the third time, welcome to the Bookly Podcast. We're actually going to go through it this time. I'll just clip out everything before that with all the technical difficulties because this has been rough. Not as smooth sailing as the first time doing the remote podcast, but I think we figured it out. So thank you for joining the podcast. And this week's book is Ordinary Grace. And I've been trying to start off every episode reading kind of the summary of the book. So I want to read the summary first right off the bat to get started. And then we can start diving into what you thought about it. So,
okay.
And the last couple of these, I've been having Olivia read them because my reading out loud sucks. But, so you'll have to bear with me through that. But it is, okay, New Bremen, Minnesota, 1961. The Twins are playing their debut season. Ice cold root beers are selling out of soda counters at Holderson's drugstore, and hot stuff comic books are a mainstay at every barbershop magazine rack. It was a life of innocence and hope for a county with a new young president, or country with a new young president. But for 13-year-old Frank Drum, it was a summer in which death visited frequently and assumed many forms: accident, nature, suicide, and murder. Frank begins the season preoccupied with the concerns of a teenage boy, but when tragedy unexpectedly strikes his family, which includes his Methodist minister father, his passionate artistic mother, Juilliard-bound older sister, and wise beyond his years kid's brother, he finds himself thrust into the adult world full of secrets, lies, adultery, and betrayal, suddenly called upon to demonstrate a maturity and gumption beyond his years. Told from Frank's perspective 40 years after the fateful summer, Ordinary Grace is a brilliant moving account of a boy standing at the door of his young manhood, trying to understand a world that seems to be falling apart around him. It is an unforgettable novel about discovering the terrible price of wisdom and enduring grace of God. Wow, that was a really, really long description. But man, I swear, usually the Goodreads and Amazon descriptions are not that long. So thanks for bearing with me if you read through that. And I'm sure that actually didn't describe the book whatsoever, but what did you, well, and I guess you should introduce yourself, but you've already been on the podcast once. You did Boys in the Boat back in December, but
yes,
you are Quinn, right? Yeah.
I am Quinn, Adam's wife.
Nice. Adam's been on the podcast a couple times.
Yes. I guess a new thing for me to introduce is the background of where I'm at. This is my dad's office. So I spent a good part of my childhood growing up in Georgia. That's where my dad's family is from. And he's still where I consider home.
Yeah.
But
he's a bit of a Georgia fan.
A bit of a fan. Yes. This is like, if I had to boil my family culture down into one thing, it would be the Georgia Bulldogs. That's what everyone knows us for. It is, from the time I was born, like our identity. So yeah. This very well illustrates my family.
You guys almost named your kid Georgia, didn't you?
Yeah.
At least Adam said you guys were close. Like it was like it's that big of fans at that point.
Yeah, I would say, and I think that because of the team, that's why we didn't. I didn't take the name seriously. Adam actually, it was one of his ideas early on when we knew we were expecting, and I was like, we cannot do that, especially right now. Like maybe in the future when Georgia hadn't just won multiple national championships, everyone would have thought that was really weird. And if I was naming my baby that, it would be more for the state than it would be for the team. I would never do that. So anyway, but yes, that was a consideration.
Nice.
And Adam's, it was his favorite girl name.
Was it your dad's favorite too?
Oh, my dad would have been humiliated if we had named her that. Yes.
He wouldn't have loved it?
If he had to tell his coworkers that his granddaughter's name was Georgia, the crap he would have gotten forever. So I'm like, if we do it, I told Adam, I was like, I really do actually like the name. It's grown on me. But if we did it, it would have to be for like a second or third daughter. Okay. So that the limelight wasn't so strong. At that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, your dad's first grandchild wasn't named Georgia.
Yeah, I was like, I can't do that. So.
That would have been awesome.
But that is a critical part of my identity. So that was a good introduction.
Nice. So going back to the book then, Ordinary Grace. What did you, just initial thoughts? What did you think of the book?
My initial thoughts are that it wasn't what I expected. When I first heard the name of the book, I thought it must be some kind of religious book written by some kind of church, some religion. I don't know. That's just what it sounded like. But as I read it, my next impressions were that it felt very much like Stand By Me. Like that was the kind of the feeling that I got from the book. Was it just reminded me of that movie. I've never read the short story that it's based off of by Stephen King, but that's kind of the feeling that it had, the time, the railroad tracks, and that being a central part of the book, the theme of death and kind of being a young boy on the verge of manhood, like the description says. So that was the thing that I kept coming back to while I was reading.
Did you like the book?
I did like the book. I read it really, really fast.
Okay. I
finished it at 10 minutes before we were supposed to start our call.
Nice.
But I enjoyed it. I liked it.
Okay. So was it like one of your favorite books ever? So this book gets a pretty wide like variety of like people love or hate it, but it was actually listed as a top 100. What was it? Let me look at it one more time. Top 100 best mystery and thriller books of all time by Time Magazine. So it was wow. way up there. That's as far as that goes.
A lot of praise.
And then it got I can't remember what. There's some award that's like a sticker on the front of the book. But it apparently is like only given to one book every single year for mysteries and thrillers, and it won it for the year that it came out. So it's like really? It's a pretty like acclaimed book, I feel like, at least as far as what I was reading about it. And I don't know. I've talked to a couple people who say that it's, top 10 favorite book of all time. Would it kind of fit into like, where would you fit it into the books that you've read within the past year? Because you read quite a few books every year. It's like, would you put it in your top 10, 15 books of the year?
That's a good question. I really liked it. I honestly, though, I'm kind of surprised that it made those lists. Not that I didn't think it was bad in any way. I just don't know if I felt like it was remarkable to me. It felt similar to other things that I've read, but it didn't make like maybe the impact that hearing those awards I would have assumed it would make.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to formulate and think about how many books I read in a year and if it would be in my, I would say maybe top 15.
Okay.
I think that might be fair. I have to see a list of the books that I've read to really be able to answer the question. Yeah. But honestly, I liked it. I wouldn't say that it was one of my all-time favorites, but it's one that I'll remember, definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to talk about. So
I would kind of say the same thing. Like I really enjoyed it. And as far as books that I've done on the podcast, I think I would put it in definitely the top 10 books I've done on the podcast, because I've only done I think 30-ish books now. So it's definitely in my upper third for sure. Okay. And maybe even higher than top 30. I mean, I really liked it. However, I felt like, kind of like you were saying, I don't know that it's distinguishes itself from other books, because I felt like, to me, all I kept thinking about was To Kill a Mockingbird. It just felt like To Kill a Mockingbird to me, which I absolutely love. And so I felt like it played a lot off of very similar classics in historical classics without distinguishing itself from them. But it felt very similar. So it was enjoyable to read because you kind of felt like you were reading a classic, but at the same time I felt like it never made that jump to be new, if that makes sense.
It does. That's, yeah. I think you very well encapsulated what I felt. Like, I enjoyed it because I think it felt like other books that I've enjoyed. So I had no complaints. But yeah, I don't think there was anything that elevated it above any of those other books.
Mm-hmm.
And because those other ones came first, I have to like give them a little bit more of the credit.
Yeah.
I don't know. So
that was my next question.
Yeah.
Cause like, so that's a lot of the complaints that I read on. Cause I always love going to Goodreads because people on Goodreads are creative and awful and generally pretty mean to books. And so I'm always like, oh, what do the mean people say about this book? You know?
Yeah, I'm curious.
And that was a lot of what people were saying. So one of the biggest complaints about the book is definitely that it feels too similar to a lot of other books. People said that it was like a mix of To Kill a Mockingbird and Tom Sawyer. And there were a couple other just like classic books that people said, you know, it was basically a ripoff of those books and it doesn't provide anything new. Do you feel like that like detracts from a book for you, or do you compare it like only to itself? If that makes sense. Like, do you like reading this book? Did you feel like because it felt similar to other books, it was a net negative, or do you just feel like it can only be so good, like can't be elevated past those books that it pulls from? Like, what is the difference between? I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like, what's the like? Can you only get so far in imitation? Did you feel like this book imitated books too much, or kind of where would you draw that line?
Yeah, I think I appreciate when a book is able to. I don't know if I expect it to be a huge difference, and so that's where I'm kind of caught in the middle of like, well, am I gonna dig myself a hole by saying this? And that, yes, I think it sort of detracts for me if I had to like give the book a score. I think the fact that it does feel so reminiscent of other things and doesn't feel that different, or sets itself apart, kind of dings it for me. But at the same time, I'm like, what do I want from it that's different though? How much more do I expect? What would I have wanted for this book to set it apart? And I don't know if I can answer that. So I'm like caught in the two spaces, if that makes sense. That's,
it does.
Yeah.
Because for me, I remember finishing To Kill a Mockingbird and being like, man, I just wish this, like I could live in this book longer. You know what I mean? Like I loved, I just wanted to be able to read it again for the first time. And I felt like books like this give you a chance to almost, not that they were completely similar. I mean, the stories were very different,
right,
but just like the overall tone, the writing, the way it was narrated, the perspective of kind of like a younger individual, you know, it just does feel very reminiscent of that. And so I felt like this book kind of provided almost like a gateway back into the books that I love. And I thought that was really fun about it. And I think that's why I liked it so much, is because although it isn't the books, like it isn't those books that I like absolutely love, it almost felt like it was my door back into those books with a brand new story.
Yeah, it definitely plays on like the nostalgia of stories like it. And I think that might be why people have enjoyed it a lot. Again, not that it was a bad book at all.
No.
I liked it. But yeah, I think maybe it did better because people were nostalgic for books like it.
Yeah. Yeah, because some people online are just absolutely like, I mean, just downright mean about it. Like they were just like, he's like, oh, the author couldn't come up with anything original. Just basically took story, like took books and rewrote them for his own like glory. And I was like, no, I felt like it was a completely different story, but it like you have to draw from something, right? Like you have to, like everybody has inspiration. You know what I mean? You're never like, I don't think anybody is 100% completely creative. Like you draw from something. And if what you draw from
creativity is borrowing from other people and just, I don't know if not even adjusting, but altering it so it's a new thing. So I feel conflicted in saying, oh, I wish it was different from but it was. So I kind of have to put my foot, like I'm putting my foot in my mouth there. But anyway, I echo your thoughts.
So the other biggest complaint, and I can't speak to this at all, but did you read the physical copy or did you listen to it?
I read it on my Kindle.
Okay. So the author, which I thought was interesting, he actually said that he wrote this book for people to listen to. Like he said that he wrote it kind of in mind that it would be a story that would be, again, listened to. He was very excited for it to be made into an audiobook. Like he thought that that was kind of the way that the book should actually be digested.
Interesting.
But the other big complaint about the book was basically that punctuation was an absolute mess, that there were no commas in the entire book and that they were just run-on sentences forever. And you being you being an English major, I don't know if that drove you.
Sometimes I was like, why didn't he use a comma here?
So I was wondering if that drove you absolutely nuts, because I couldn't see that at all. But then, because I just listened to it. And so I was like, oh man, this story's amazing. And then I went through the comments and it was literally like every other negative comment was, does this guy know what a comma is? Does this guy know punctuation? Was he just trying to write like a 13-year-old? Like that was literally the comments back to back to back to back. So I was wondering,
That
with
is
your
so funny.
English degree, if that drove you nuts while reading the book.
You know what? It didn't drive me nuts. And I'll tell you why. I noticed it, definitely, and I had questions about it. I noticed it from the get-go. And there were certain points that it stood out to me more than others. I can't remember that, but there was this distinct chapter where the whole first paragraph was like back to back. The sentences were like that. And he uses a lot of phrases in the middle of sentences that would normally be bracketed by commas that weren't. And so I noticed it totally. But it didn't drive me crazy because I think that my personal feeling, loving writing myself and also having worked as a writing consultant at a university for 2 years, is that commas, I don't think there's a reason to be as big of a jerk about commas as some people are. Okay. I think in creative writing, I think commas, I think you can choose how much you use them a little bit more. There are certain things that I will do with commas in creative writing that I won't do in, like if I was writing a paper for a class, for example, So I noticed it, questioned it, but I made my peace with it and moved on. It didn't bother me. So it's funny that you asked that, though. Yeah,
that is
totally
interesting. Because I felt like that was also a little bit uncalled for as far as the criticism goes. Because isn't that like the job of the editor? Like, shouldn't he have been going through that? Like, shouldn't your editor go through and be like, yeah, you should probably throw a couple more commas in here and do that? Like, that has nothing to do with him as the author.
No, and I mean, granted, I don't know a lot about editing and publishing world. I would love to learn more, but part of me wonders too if it became an element of style. That's what I was meaning to explain earlier, is that in creative writing, I think the use of commas sometimes comes down to style and the choice of the author. And so I wonder if the editor brought it up as a concern and then they kind of made the decision together to not change it or to limit. I don't know. I would love to hear what the conversation was there, especially knowing now that was a beef for so many people.
Yeah. The other thing I always look up a little bit about the author, because I always want to know, because obviously background and stuff plays into the way that you write and your stories that you tell. Yeah. So he basically just had a high school education. So his freshman year of college, he was kicked out of college for basically taking over and occupying the president of the school's office in protest for the Vietnam War. And so he was just booted out of college his freshman year. And he started a career as a logger and in construction until he started writing. Like, he wasn't the world's most educated writer. You know what I mean?
No.
So he started writing, he always apparently had a passion for writing, and that's what he wanted to do. So he'd wake up at 5:30 every morning and go to the cafe, write for an hour before work. And he did that every single day and just would write short stories and write, whatever he could. And he'd write every morning and then go to work as a construction worker, and eventually became this, he's a pretty big writer now. We were walking through the bookstore, and I mean, he's got almost an entire row of books for just himself. He's got his own mystery series that he writes. He's got 4 or 5 standalone novels on top of that. And
Wow, I didn't know that.
yeah, so he's like, I mean, kind of a big deal as far as writing goes now.
Yeah.
And again, I feel like the commas was just such a dumb thing to get hooked up on. But I mean, I guess I didn't notice it at all because I listened to it. But if you noticed it, maybe it was kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know. People pick interesting battles in my eyes. I guess I understand why it might be annoying, but I think commas are something that people really struggle with. At least when I was working as a writing consultant at BYU, um, that was like often one of the number one things when people would come in and their thing was due that afternoon and they were like, I don't really want you to look at the big picture stuff. I just want some sentence level help. Can you see where I'm putting commas? And so I helped with commas. And yeah, I think in creative writing, it's such a personal thing, which is funny. A lot of people don't care about that, but I do. So I will defend his weird use of commas. I think it's weird. I wouldn't have done what he had did, but I will defend his choice.
Do you think it played in at all into it being narrated by, I think he was 13 at the time? You know what I mean? It's like supposed to be narrated by a 13-year-old boy.
He's like telling it. Well, it seems like he's telling it from like 40 years later.
I guess that is true. But yeah, he's from the perspective.
Still like re-experiencing sort of as his 13-year-old self.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, I could maybe see that being an element, but also now knowing his background, maybe he just didn't care where he put his commas and his editor didn't care that much either.
Yeah. And he was just like, I'm going to throw out this story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. So those were the two biggest complaints. I always like going over complaints because I always like just talking about what your thoughts were. So those were the two biggest complaints about the book, were definitely that it tried too hard to be a classic, punctuation. And then the third biggest complaint was kind of your social justice warrior complaints about the book being like too misogynistic. Like all of the female characters were kind of put into a derogatory light. Like you had the mother who leaves her family. You had the sister who was sleeping around. You had the girlfriend who was called a skag. And then you had, I mean, spoiler, but you had the murderer being also a woman. And then all of the kind of people solving stories around and trying to do good things were the father, the two brothers, Gus. And so that was kind of one of the biggest complaints, is that all of the women kind of had a negative light to them and all of the men had a positive light, which I didn't get while reading the story at all. But kind of looking back at it now, there weren't a lot of positive women role models throughout the book. The only one that I could think of was the grandmother, who was just described as like Liz. Yeah. Who was happy and was just trying to keep the family together and doing her best the whole time. But other than that, there weren't a ton of strong female roles. And then obviously the other things that it didn't like, kind of in that same light, was anything to do with Native Americans is kind of like hard to touch, apparently. A lot of people complained that they assumed that, I can't remember his name, but the main
Warren
was the
Warren
Redstone.
Redstone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Warren Redstone, that he was the killer automatically, but I thought that would have been historically accurate. Like I didn't feel like that one would have been.
I think that's the point.
Yeah.
Right.
Was the prejudice. But people didn't like that. People didn't like that they just automatically assumed. And then also they also didn't like the use of the word faggot throughout the book to describe homosexuality. But again, like we're talking early 60s. So again, historically accurate. But again, I don't know, people were upset that that's the way that it was used. And yeah, I think that was the majority of kind of those complaints. Do you see any of that? Like, does that stuff bother you at all? Or do you feel like, do you prioritize historically accurate over like your current?
Yes.
Okay.
It takes place in the 60s. Like, and I just find those complaints so interesting because it's not like the author is how do I say this? In all those instances, the author, I feel like, is or not the author. I'm not gonna the narrator, because those are two different people. But the narrator like points out that when he uses the word faggot, he says like, "Oh, don't use that word." Like you. So I think in each one of those instances, I'll get to the misogyny thing in a minute, but I think in each of those instances, I just don't make that. No, I think it's a historical fiction book. It would not make sense for them to be using terminology that comes from 2024. And I don't think that the writing was in any way trying to establish those terms or behaviors as right in a moral sense. Like I think in each one he's pointing to away from that.
Yeah. I think it would
that
be
those complaints are weird.
I just think it would be so
know.
weird if all of a sudden somebody was like throwing out 2022 terms, 2023 terms, or whatever it is, like modern, gender theory terms in the middle of the 1960s just to try to create a book that was politically correct. Like it would almost take you out of the book. You know what I mean? Like you want people to be immersed in your story and feel like they're there. Mm-hmm. So to kind of mix both of those things, to me, ruins a book. Like it would, honestly, it would make me more uncomfortable than just keeping me in the time period and allowing me to use my own personal judgment and say like, you know what, we shouldn't be, automatically assuming that because he's a Native American that he killed that girl. You know what I mean? Like I can do that own mental gymnastics myself. I don't need the author to do that mental gymnastics for me.
Yeah. And I think like I mentioned before, the oh my gosh, I keep saying the narrator, but it's Frank. Frank
Dern,
as an older version of himself, like will sometimes reflect on mistakes that he regrets, like, condemning Warren Redstone at the beginning. And I don't even think that it was because he was Native American. I feel like it was more because he had his sister's locket. And the fact, I guess people have beef with the fact that the character was a Native American, but I think that plays into exactly what you said, like the historical accuracy of the time, and that people would have jumped to conclusions based on his identity and his background. So that made sense for the story, and he didn't end up being the killer either.
I know.
So
yeah, and they ended up being friends at the end. They had their nice little, together moment in the grave, and like I don't know. I didn't pick that up at all. And then again, reading through the book or reading through the comments, I was like, man, people really, they want something so specific from a book that they're almost unhappy with anything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I try not to be like that. I really try. So that, yeah, I think that's silly. And I think it's interesting, the whole misogyny lens, because I didn't think of that at all while I was reading either. It never bothered me. I think that I liked how much the boys looked up to Ariel. Like they had a really great relationship with her, and really, I mean, from the get-go, I figured either Ariel or Jake was going to die because of the way that Frank saw them as bigger than they were, almost like these elevated individuals who they could do wrong, but he really looked up to them. And so I think there were good things about Ariel. She was a wonderful sister. And I don't think their moms struggle with faith. I think that was realistic. Like, I think she was an interesting, compelling character because she's married to a minister and didn't set out for that life, and she's bitter about it. And Like, I don't know. I think having the women have problems is just a consequence of having complex characters.
Yeah.
I think the men had problems too. I think the only person in this book who was pretty much faultless was Nathan, their dad.
But even he had his
calm. Yeah, even he had his problems. Like, that's
he
what
had all his
I say.
war.
Almost.
He had like all his war PTSD, and
Yes.
you know, like they talk, you know, frequently about that without directly addressing it. But I mean, he hints towards Gus basically the entire time that he has all of these skeletons in his closet.
Yeah. So I think there are like, to say that all of the men. I mean, Frank is an idiot and knows it. He does stupid stuff throughout the whole book. Jake, I would say Jake is like the most, besides Nathan, I think Jake and Nathan are the two characters that are the most like morally good.
Which one was
and
Jake?
And that Jake was the little brother.
Wait, which one's Nathan then?
The dad.
Okay, Nathan's the dad. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so he, I mean, despite having PTSD and being afraid of fireworks, like that's not like a personal character problem. Like, he was very calm with every situation that he was confronted with. He tried his very best to be empathetic with his wife, who was struggling with being angry at God, understandably. Like, I think he was a really solid character. I think when I was reading Olivia's review of the book, she compared him to Atticus Finch, which you said that this book reminds you a lot of.
Yeah, they were basically
Mockingbird.
They were basically the same character to me. Like, just like the completely like straight moral compass. Nothing else matters besides like you're like doing the right thing, and you're willing to take flack no matter what to just do the right thing. Like, they were the same character to me.
Right. So I think Nathan was the exception, and Jake, but even Jake gets mad. Like, he gets angry.
Yeah, I mean, he shuts down after his sister dies. I mean, like, completely. Yeah. Stops going outside, doesn't talk to his friends, doesn't talk to his family, stops going to church.
Yes, so he has his outbursts. He's not a perfectly patient. And all the other male characters, I think, definitely had their faults. So I think that's not fair to say that all the men were good characters and all the women were bad.
Yeah.
That was my reading of it.
That was my reading of it too. Like, definitely. I agree with you. I think if you want complex characters, you have to be able to accept complex characters. You can't have both. You know, like, you can't be like wanting to read books with complex characters, but have them all be complex in the way that you want them to be. Like, does that make sense? Like, you can't pick and choose
the like, way if you want that, you should write your own book and see
exactly. Or
and problems people have.
Yeah, and if you want characters that are just, you know, like, you know, always make the right choices and everything like that, and don't have any faults, then it's going to be a boring book.
No story.
It's going to be a boring book. Like,
there's no conflict.
It's not relatable at all. Like, that's what makes all of the characters very relatable. Like, honestly, I think one of the most relatable characters was probably his mother, with just kind of the like her complete meltdown of like not believing in God anymore after her arc of losing her daughter. You know what I mean? Like, I think that was almost like, I mean, that was probably one of the biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest and most important character arcs of the whole book was her relationship, you know, before the tragedy, during the tragedy, and after Nathan's prayer, or not Nathan's prayer, whatever the brother, his name is, Jake's prayer. And that whole like character arc, I think, was probably the most powerful and most moving character in the whole book, in my opinion. So to say that, like, I don't know, the women were only used to be painted in a negative light, to me kind of downplays the effect that they have on the book. Because, like I said, she was actually probably one of the most impactful characters in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I'm liking this, reading the things that people took issue with, because sometimes when I read something and I can't put my finger on why I didn't like the book, it's nice to read reviews and be like, oh yeah, exactly. But other times it's nice to be able to refute them, and then I can actually say what I liked, or I don't know. So it's interesting. It's just, it's fun.
So that was everything that nobody likes. So now that you've like had fun doing that, that's over. We're going to be done with that and just move past that. But next I kind of wanted to dive into kind of the religious aspect of the book because it was surprisingly religious to me without also being very religious. Like it towed that line very, very well, in my opinion. But I wanted to ask, do you read, I mean, a lot of religious books outside of just, scripture?
No.
No? Okay. Did you?
I've read a few, but not regularly.
Would you classify this book as a religious book?
No.
No. Did you feel moved at all by this book, though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. This is like the kind of book that I love, and that I sometimes feel like spiritual commentary comes better from books that aren't spiritual. At least they reach more people. And I think it makes more people think than the population of people who will pick up a explicitly religious book. So I think, for example, I just read a fantasy book in which a couple of the characters are really religious. And they say really profound things about God and spirituality, but because it's in a fantasy, like they get away with it. But I think I learned things and I was like, wow, I really like pondered what they said. So for me, I really like the package when it comes in like a historical fiction, murder, mystery, whatever you want to call this. Like, I was definitely moved by some of the things that were said in this book.
Yeah, I honestly expected kind of the religious aspect of the book to be the number one complaint. Be like, oh, there's too much talking about God, too much talking about grace, too much of an emphasis on like the Dern's family, like the Dern family's connection to spirituality. Like I thought that was going to be too much of a focus, especially for a book that's technically mystery and thriller, I think is the actual like genre of this book. I thought that would have been the number one complaint when I was reading through the complaints. Like I was like, I'm ready to read a bunch of people that are just pissed off that this has religious undertones in it. And honestly, not one. I scrolled for a while of people. Not one person felt like that was their number one concern with the book. And even the people who really, really loved the book, that wasn't their number one reason why they loved the book either. Like it wasn't like, oh, made me feel connected to God or it didn't. But I felt like with it being it's the title of the book. It's like everything that happens in the book is centered around this idea of grace. And yet like a lot of people felt connected to the book without identifying it with spirituality, if that makes sense. And I felt like that almost played into kind of how powerful the book is, in my opinion. And that it's able to connect you to kind of these ideas that come from religion without being overtly religious and kind of feel almost natural and feel almost like obvious, if that makes sense. It takes religion and makes it relatable to even the people who are not religious. And I felt like that was like a really, really neat with the book because we go to church every Sunday and, there's a lot of times that I feel like even at church or even listening to things from church, like I don't connect with them very well sometimes. Like there are some things that obviously I connect with more than others. And, listening to some people, I can like feel that connection better. However, I felt like this was almost a natural, like connective, like idea straight from like this story into this grace, this idea of grace and how, God plays in each one of our lives.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's hard to feel like the theme of like the ideas of God are forced when it's a book about multiple deaths happening close to this teenager who's like trying to figure out what he believes. I mean, who's not going to think about that when they're confronted with the death of their sister? They have to really they have a minister for a dad and a mom who is very bitter toward God and really just says like she doesn't believe in God. Like we are the only thing that we have for each other. So it feels like a very natural theme to appear in the book, 100%. And I think, like you said, I think in some ways that's where the real thoughts and pondering happens instead of maybe a more quote unquote forced situation. But yeah.
So I wanted to ask you because they kind of move between the idea of, what is it, ordinary grace and it's not terrible grace, but what is it? Awful grace. Back and forth. So I wanted to get your ideas on what you would define as grace and then kind of ordinary grace and awful grace. Like how would you move between those three ideas? Because the book kind of jumps between them frequently.
Yes. Yeah, so the title of the book being Ordinary Grace, I was obviously had my eyes out for that in the book subconsciously. And I think the first time that the author brings up grace, it's more of the awful grace idea. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, oh, I don't know. That just kind of surprised me. But then it keeps coming up. And for me, I think when he's talking about awful grace, it feels, if I'm remembering right, he talks a lot about the idea of wisdom and that it takes experiencing some awful things sometimes to gain wisdom. And honestly, I think maybe I'll figure out what I think as I keep talking with you and we have this conversation. Because like I said, I had just finished the book like 10 minutes before running up to try to figure out how to work this technology. And I mean, thinking about what grace is to begin with, I definitely bring my own beliefs to the table when reading a book like this. Like my understanding of grace as a Christian is that kind of the idea that we're all sinners and we all mess up, and that grace is like God and Jesus Christ knowing that we're sinners and loving us in spite of that and making a way for us to to make things simple, go to heaven either way, and to make up for our mistakes. So like that's kind of my idea of grace coming into it. And then so obviously that informed when I was reading about the idea of awful grace. And I can't even remember where they talk about ordinary grace, but when I'm thinking about it, I think of that moment with Jake where his stutter goes away when he's saying that prayer, and how to everyone else, yeah, they knew he had a stutter. But like to him, that was a miracle. And he goes to his speech therapy the next week. And he's like, yeah, a miracle happened to me. Like, I don't have a stutter in it anymore. And they're just like, we don't understand why you don't have an impediment. It's definitely not a miracle. Like, we're not, to me, that was a little bit of the ordinary grace, like these little miracles in our lives that to us maybe are really significant and to others aren't. I don't know. I think there may be multiple meanings in the way that I would define it. Yeah. So again, like, I guess to come full circle, the awful grace to me is like, we have to experience some really hard things to get wisdom and to figure out what we believe in and to actually experience God in our lives or seek to experience God in our lives. I think a lot of times bad things happen or have to happen in order for us to be in a place where we're genuinely interested in whether we believe. And then ordinary grace, again, I think is just some of these miracles that happen to us that other people don't. treat as miracles or just seem like everyday changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I like that. So just a little bit of background on the two of them. So originally the book was actually going to be called Awful Grace. That's what the name of the book was. And then the author said that that was just an awful title. And so he actually went with Ordinary Grace and kind of tied it into Ordinary Grace. But the idea of that awful grace of God comes from the quote from Ulysses, which is like, I think, Greek philosopher. But it says, in our own despair against our will comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. So like you said, it's that kind of the idea behind the book was that, within the despair and within the kind of the tragedy that comes through life, that you gain kind of wisdom and understanding through the grace of God. And I think, so the author got that idea originally from, he was listening to a speech, I believe by Robert F. Kennedy at the funeral for his brother, JFK. And that's when he heard that quote for the first time. And when he heard that quote for the first time, that's when he realized that he wanted to write a book around that idea, that kind of that awful grace and the kind of the wisdom that the Kennedys have got over the years through the tragedy of JFK's assassination, which was kind of an interesting, he said he kind of took that, put it in his back pocket, and he said he knew that he was going to eventually write a book around that idea. And so when I was reading the book, kind of the character that I felt like embodied that the most was the dad. His name's Jake, right? Or he's Nathan.
Jake is the brother.
I'm so bad with names. Nathan the dad was kind of the embodiment of that awful grace, because you see kind of who he was before the war. Then you have obviously the despair, the destruction, the events of living through and being, a commander through World War II. And then you have who he comes out of the war as. And that was kind of, in my opinion, the embodiment of awful grace was Nathan and his story, because of who he became, because of the despair, because of everything like that. It was through the grace of God that he's able to be kind of that steady, rock solid character in the book. And it was not fun for him to get there, and it was terrible. But he got there nonetheless because of the terrible things in his life. Because before that, he was going to be this rock star lawyer, and he was going to fight the world and be rich and all sorts of things. But because of the tragedy, he actually became kind of a man that, throughout the entire book, the entire town goes to and like really trusts him, believes in him. He's a confidant for people. He's a support for people. People rely on him. He supports, a large swath of the community, and I don't think he'd be able to do that without his prior experiences. So he, to me, was kind of that embodiment of awful grace. And then his mom was actually the embodiment, I thought, of ordinary grace. Someone who's kind of going through tragedy and doesn't come out of the tragedy with wisdom like her husband did, but instead, like, you see the hand of God mold her through, like you said, that prayer that Jake gives. And it's a miracle to her, and not even like a big miracle, but it's kind of that small little, even up until moments before the prayer was given, when she's basically harassing her husband about saying a prayer.
Yeah.
To kind of that small little moment in her life that, like you said, seems ordinary for everybody else. Her son just gave a quick, it's like 20-word prayer over some food, but that changed her life completely. And so to me, her story was the ordinary grace of God, God making her someone who has gone through something terrible, but comes out of it. Again, a loving mother. She, at the end of the book, is very like, she stays married to her husband. She's, very involved in her kid's life. She's playing music again. She forgives her friends and everything, but it's a very different journey for the two of them, if that makes sense. And so I thought that it was really neat that they used both characters, in my opinion. And I could be reading into this completely wrong. Maybe he didn't write it like that, but to me, both characters ended up with grace but a very different type of grace and a very different experience.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, it doesn't really matter at this point what the author meant to do. It matters what we get out of it. And there's things to learn if we want to know what the author meant to do. But, yeah, no, I think that interpretation's really makes a ton of sense. Yeah, because Frank says something about how Jake offered like the most ordinary grace over this meal that no one would have ever remembered, but 40 years later he can still remember it word for word because his brother didn't stutter in front of all of these people, because every row was like full or whatever. Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head.
So for you then, how do you personally grasp onto these little, because I feel like that's then the biggest problem, and probably why a lot of people maybe don't classify things as grace, is because they just don't recognize them. Like, it was really neat for Jake in this time period because he was obviously going through a hard time. So it was easy, like when you're down in the dumps, it's easy to recognize the hand of God in your life. It's easy to recognize those moments that kind of pull you out of things. But for, the normal person walking day to day, I feel like the idea of grace, this idea that there's somebody out there watching out for you, doesn't really cross a lot of people's minds. And so how do you, one, keep that in the forefront of your mind, but also, so let's start off with that. Like, how do you keep that in the forefront of your mind?
I think really a big part of it is it's how I was raised. My mom grew up in she had a really hard childhood. My grandma was remarried like 3 times and was not in relationships with very good men. My grandma, I think she kind of went to church here and there, but she's never been a very devout anything. And my mom kind of, grew up in this world and then was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a 16-year-old. And like before that time, I don't know if she had like any kind of relationship with God. And so for starters, I have that. That's my mom. And my dad is very religious. And so I grew up going to church every Sunday, reading the Bible, reading the Book of Mormon. So that was kind of the lens that I approached life with. But I think as we grow up and we experience things on our own, we live on our own, we have our own families, we have to decide what we really believe. And we go through experiences that question that. And I remember being like, I don't know, 17 going on 18, about to graduate, leave home. And so I was leaving the congregation that I had been attending since I was 14. And my bishop, which was the ecclesiastical leader of this congregation, was talking to me about, leaving home and what my feelings were. And I remember he told me that he was telling me about this invention for people who are colorblind. It was like these glasses that restored their vision so that they could actually see colors like the average person sees colors. And they were all astounded at what they saw. And by the way, I'm telling you this more because I think what the bishop said is very helpful than I thought it was true at the time. But he was like, Quinn, I feel like you live life with these glasses. And again, I don't really think that was the case. But because he said that, I've reflected on it again and again through my life and realized like seeing grace, like you've said, is more of a decision to live your life with that lens or not.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will think that like because I'm looking for it, I'm inventing it. Maybe, in their eyes that might be the case, but I choose to think differently. I've had experiences that lead me to think otherwise. So yeah, I think the difference and how I keep it in the forefront, like you said, of my mind is that I have to choose it because sometimes I don't. Sometimes I let other things distract me, and then I don't see these little moments of grace in my life. So it's a choice.
Yeah. I think that's awesome because I think it is important. I mean, regardless of where you are, I guess on the religious spectrum of things,
Mm-hmm.
I think reading a book like this it's really neat because again, it's not just somebody getting up and saying like you need to do this, and this. Like you need to be looking out for these grace because it's there and you have to find it and otherwise you're going to hell. You know what I mean? Like that, like listening to something like that can be a little bit disheartening, but reading a book like this kind of shows you gives you, even if you're not religious, again, no matter where you are on that religious spectrum, gives you an experience of realizing what searching for that grace gives you. So like the characters in the book become better as they recognize God's grace in their lives. Regardless of if it actually has an effect on their lives, their perceived like blessing of grace in their lives turn them to be happier, more connected, like more forgiving individuals in their lives in general. And so regardless of, again, your experiences or anything like that, adopting that mindset of I'm going to be looking for these positive blessings in my life, which you can attribute to, again, what I believe to be the grace of God, and attributing those and developing that attitude of humility, a little bit of, of gratefulness and everything, and just looking for those things, I think will make you a better person in the long term, regardless of whether you call it grace or not. And I think that one great thing about this book is it shows you what that looks like from a religious perspective, but also without telling you how to do it. Like these people just look for the good things in their lives, and it has good consequences by doing that. And they obviously attribute that to God, but I think it's important that regardless of where you are, that you do take time to recognize that there are good things that happen to you around your life, and you can be, one, grateful for them, and two, if you focus on the good things, if you focus on the graces all around you, that it makes you a happier person in general. Again, I keep coming back to the mom because I thought in my mind she had the best character arc in the whole book. But from somebody who was shut into her house, closed the blinds, basically chain smoked and drank because her daughter died, to somebody who took 2 seconds to realize that something good around them was happening. And just that recognition of positivity in her life, that recognition of something bigger than herself, changed her life dramatically. And it never really goes into, it says that she started coming back to the congregation and that she would sing, but it never ever talks about her religious conversion. And I thought that was actually really neat. I liked that it didn't talk about her religious conversion because it kind of leaves the door open for, regardless of where she was at in her beliefs, that recognition of something bigger than yourself and that kind of positive outlook on things can have an effect on you regardless of where you're at within your personal conversion. Because she was obviously much further behind than Nathan, who was the pastor and was literally, again, the most rock solid character in the whole book. But she still had quite a transformation from grace, even though, her own personal religious journey was definitely not what I would call rock solid.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think the fact that Nathan is the only person who is outright, like very constantly sharing his belief and like going back to God. I mean, Frank definitely thinks about it, but it's not like something that I don't know, every time that the idea of God comes up, like sometimes it's Frank's thoughts, but a lot of the time it is Nathan. And similarly, like I don't know if there's a big there's no, I not that I can think of, there's never a time where Frank is like, and that's what made me believe in God, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think that ever happens either. He's just kind of the vessel through which we see like Nathan and the mom like juggling with these themes. And I think that's a really powerful way to, ask a reader to think about them instead of like an outright sermon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that that's why overall, like I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Again, I do think it plays a lot on kind of classics. It almost felt like it was written to be a classic. Like he was trying to write a classic and he sat down thinking about, I want to write a classic.
Mm-hmm.
But the story is so vastly different that regardless of whether or not he pulls elements of other characters or he pulls, themes or time periods. I mean, he's writing in kind of like, again, that early 60s time period, whatever it is that you feel like he's pulling from classics. I feel like he created a story that made me think about something different than any other book that I've read. Like it was much more, again, it was much more religious without being religious than I would say most classics are. Like it was very similar, but also very different, which is what I really, really enjoyed about the book.
Yeah. Unless you were hoping to take this in a different direction, I have a question.
No, go for it.
I'm wondering what you thought of the big, like the reveal at the end. If you saw it coming, if you were surprised, at what point, if you did see it coming, at what point it became clear to you?
The moment I found out that Carl was gay.
Yeah.
I could guess the whole rest of the book.
Yeah.
I don't think that the mystery had its turns and I liked that there were pieces early on in the book that maybe you could have followed those breadcrumbs and found it. Because again, that's my biggest pet peeve with any mystery book is if at the very end, the final reveal is something that comes out of left field and you never ever would have guessed. I hate books like that. This at least placed like breadcrumbs the entire time for you. Like you knew that there were things that could lead to that sort of solution. The characters were being set up in that direction. I really enjoyed the mystery part of it. It wasn't the world's most difficult mystery to crack. Definitely once you find out one of the characters' like major plot twists in the middle of the book, then you basically know the rest of the book. And it does take a while to then uncover the rest of it. Like even though I knew it, I felt like the mystery dragged, even though the story didn't drag, if that makes sense. Like I felt like the mystery from the moment that you find out about Carl, the mystery just slowly drags along. And I'm like, all right, I know this. Like, let's just get to the end of the mystery. But I didn't feel like that about the story itself. I felt like the story was still interesting. The characters were still interesting. There was a lot of development going on. But to classify this book as a mystery, I mean, there is a mystery in it, but I didn't feel like it was the point of the book.
Right. I feel like that's the packaging, but not like what's inside. Sort of. I mean, like it relies on the mystery, but that's not really what's being accomplished. It's not like a nail-biting thriller by any means. Yeah. Okay. No, I agree. Yeah, I definitely had my suspicions about Emil the whole time. Is that how you say his name?
Who?
The pianist teacher guy.
What was his name? How did you say it?
Emil.
No.
Emil. Brand.
Yeah, I don't think that's how they pronounced it in the book, but I can't remember how they pronounced it. Maybe it is Emil.
Okay, well, that's how I read it, but I definitely was like, ooh, him and the daughter have a weird relationship. Like, this is icky.
Yeah.
I'm feeling like this is very suspicious.
Well, and then like the whole history with her mom too. Like I was like, oh, this is all gonna tie back at the end. Again, it wasn't anything hard to unpack.
No.
Like it didn't.
And the sister's like anger and possessiveness over the brother. I was like, yeah. And like I remember, as soon as because they do set up Carl to be like, I don't think he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, okay, but until that's confirmed, that he's not involved at all. But as soon as it was revealed that he was gay, I was like, oh yeah, yep. And like the sister, as soon as they said that, I remembered the sister gardening.
Yep.
When it mentioned them like her expanding the garden, and she had a crowbar that she was using to pry up the rock. I was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought, I mean, like you said, it was an interesting vessel for the story. It still made for an interesting part of it. It allowed him to kind of explore death in a couple different ways, which I think led to the actual purpose of the story again very well. So I thought it was a good vessel for it. But if you're going into it wanting it to be this like Hardy Boys murder mystery, like solve all these crimes,
then you would be disappointed.
Yes, you would be very disappointed.
But because it's not, it's really not trying to do that. Then I had no problems with the direction it went.
No, I would agree. So overall, what would you rank this book on a scale of 1 to 5 for fun and 1 to 5 for importance?
I would give it a 3 for fun, maybe. And can I do halves, or do I have to do the whole star?
Yeah, you can do halves.
I would like a 4.5 for importance. I think the themes were definitely, I don't know, maybe 5 actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, we're talking about life and death. Is there a God? Is there not? I think for me, those are really important themes. So maybe I will give it a 5.
Nice. I'm not. I am an easy judger. I mean, I don't give a whole lot of 5 and 5s, but this one to me is a 5 and 5. I enjoyed it. I honestly could not put it down. I wanted to finish it the whole time. It never felt slow to me. The characters were really fun. I loved kind of the world that it built, the town and everything like that. Like there was really no complaints on the fun side of things. Like it just, it moved along at a good clip. I never felt like I was out of the story. So to me, that's a 5. You know, if I can sit there and listen to it for as long as I need to and get it done, never want to slow down, then to me, that's a 5. I had fun reading the book, and then I agree as far as the themes of the book go. I think for a book that has such heavy weighted themes, you know, is there a God? Is there not a God? You know, how does his hand play within our lives? To be able to kind of mask those themes throughout the book and not kind of bludgeon you over the head with it is incredible. So I would give it definitely a 5 out of 5.
Yeah. I think I was thinking of fun in a different way than you were thinking of it. Cause I was like, this book isn't really like happy-go-lucky.
Well,
like there's some fun parts, but so kind of, if I were to redefine it based on how you looked at fun, I think I would give it like a 4.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Fun. I don't mean like you were laughing and having a good time as little kids are getting murdered.
That were funny. But yeah.
But I just mean anyway, overall,
I enjoyed reading it.
Yes, exactly. Enjoyment reading. So that's
the pages kept turning, and it wasn't like just because I had to do this.
Yes.
It was because I was genuinely into the story. So
yeah, and I would recommend it to people for sure. Like I'd be like, you should read that book, 100%. So yeah. Awesome. Any last comments or anything about the book before we wrap it up?
I need to start coming into these with my own notes, because there's like things that will happen in the book that I'm like, oh, I should bring that up, or I want to ask him that, and then I forget in the moment. So next time we do this, I'll bring my own notes. I will just say that I'm interested in reading more of his stuff.
Yeah.
It's cool knowing his background, and I'm a firm believer that you don't need an education in writing to be a writer.
Yeah.
I think people who think you have to have like a master's in fine arts to be a good writer, that's totally unfounded, because there's plenty of awesome writing that's not the case. And I will say my last thought is, now I'm interested in maybe listening to it in a few years, to see what the difference is. I grew up knowing a lot about Shakespeare, which I get made fun of all the time for, but there's this thing in Shakespeare, it's meant to be performed and not read.
Mm-hmm.
So the same idea, like you're supposed to hear it and see it and not read it.
Yeah.
And which I think is funny because all we do in English is read Shakespeare, which is not how he wanted it done. But now I will, in the future, I will listen to this book.
Yeah. No, I thought it was interesting. He actually mentioned that because I listened to a couple interviews from him. So he actually mentions Shakespeare as his example, just like you did. Like he said, you know, like there are specific ways that like art forms are supposed to be consumed. And he said that this book was supposed to be consumed like you're hearing a story. So he wanted it almost like sitting around a campfire listening to somebody, like somebody telling you the story instead of you reading too much into it.
Good to know.
So,
yeah, I want to re-experience it because of that.
So awesome. Well, hopefully this all recorded after all of our hiccups at the very beginning. That would be unfortunate.
That would be really sad tragedy.
But so hopefully we'll hang up here and we will be able to recover everything. But other than that, thank you for coming on the podcast again. And for everybody who's listening still, next week's book has even worse punctuation than this week's book does, if that's even possible. So next week's book is The Road, and that one has no punctuation.
Yeah.
So for anybody who was really upset with the commas, get ready for no commas, no quotation marks, no periods, no nothing in the entire book. And so we'll just go all the way to the extreme on that. So if you're reading along, that's next week's book. And for anybody who's just listening along, thank you for tuning in. Make sure that you leave us a 5-star review if you're on podcasts. And if you're listening to the podcast, or if you are watching on YouTube, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. And that's it. Thanks for listening.